Berlin, April 1945. The air smells of ash and wet stone. A leather ball, scuffed and strange, rolls across the rubble of what used to be a schoolyard. A 10-year-old boy named Helmut stares at it, his eyes hollow from months of fear and hunger. He has not played in nearly 2 years. Behind him, the skeletal remains of apartment buildings lean against the gray sky like broken teeth. The sound of American jeeps rumbling through the shattered streets is still new, still terrifying. His mother told him to stay inside, to hide, to be silent. But the ball is there, and so is the soldier. The American is young, maybe 22, with dirt on his sleeves and a smile that seems impossible in this landscape of ruin. He picks up the ball, tosses it lightly in one hand, and says something in a language Helmut does not understand. Then he mimes a throwing motion, slow and exaggerated, and points to the boy. Helmut does not move. He has been taught that Americans are monsters, that they burn cities and devour children. But the soldier is laughing, not cruelly, just laughing. This is the beginning of something the Nazi regime never prepared its children for, the encounter with an enemy that does not behave like an enemy at all. For 12 years, German children had been raised inside a fortress of ideology. From the moment they entered the Jungvolk at age 10, and later the Hitler Youth, they were conditioned to see the world through a lens of destiny and sacrifice. They were told they were the future of a 1,000-year Reich, soldiers in a holy war against degeneracy, weakness, and the mongrel democracies of the West. The regime gave them uniforms, songs, and certainties. It gave them a language of steel and blood. It taught them that strength was silence, that obedience was virtue, and that the enemy, especially the American enemy, was a soft, decadent plague upon the earth. In the classrooms of the Reich, teachers stood before maps and pointed to the United States with contempt. America was described as a land of racial chaos, a place where Jews controlled the economy and Negroes played jazz in the streets. It was a nation without discipline, without soul, a mongrel experiment doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. German children were told that American soldiers were cowards, that they hid behind machines and money because they lacked the warrior spirit. They were told that when the war was won, the Reich would stand as a monument to purity and order, and America would be nothing but a footnote in the history of failed empires. And then the Americans arrived. They did not arrive as the propaganda had promised. They arrived in endless columns of trucks and tanks, in waves that never seemed to stop. They arrived with chocolate bars in their pockets and cigarettes they handed out freely. They arrived with a strange, easy confidence, as if the war were already over and they were simply there to clean up. They arrived with baseballs. The baseball was not an object German children recognized. It was smaller than a football, harder than a handball, and covered in tight white stitching that looked almost decorative. Some children thought it was a weapon, others thought it was food. One boy in Stuttgart tried to bite into one, convinced it was some kind of dense American bread. The soldiers laughed, but not meanly. They showed the children how to hold it, how to throw it, how to catch it with a leather glove that seemed absurdly oversized and soft. To the children of the Hitler Youth, this was incomprehensible. Play was not something soldiers did. Play was frivolous, weak, a distraction from duty. German soldiers marched, drilled, fortified. They did not stand in open fields and throw leather balls to one another while laughing. And yet here were these Americans, these supposed degenerates, doing exactly that. They set up makeshift bases using helmets and rubble. They drew lines in the dirt with the heels of their boots. They shouted instructions in English, and when the children did not understand, they simply demonstrated over and over until the children began to mimic them. Helmut, the boy in Berlin, was one of the first in his neighborhood to pick up the ball. He did so cautiously as if it might explode. The American soldier, his name was Private Eddie Kowalski from Chicago, though Helmut would never learn this, showed him how to grip the seams, how to step forward and release. The first throw was clumsy. The ball sailed wide, bouncing off a pile of bricks, but Kowalski clapped his hands and jogged over to retrieve it, still smiling. He tossed it back. Helmut threw again. This time it went straighter. Kowalski shouted something in English that sounded like praise. For the first time in years, Helmut felt something other than fear or hunger. He felt curiosity. He felt something close to joy. This was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Germany, in the spring and summer of 1945, American soldiers played baseball. They played it in the ruins of Frankfurt, in the parks of Munich, in the courtyards of Nuremberg, where Nazi rallies had once filled the air with fire and fury. They played it in small villages where children had never seen a foreigner before, and in the bombed-out suburbs of Hamburg, where families lived in basements and ate soup made from nettles. The soldiers did not do this out of some grand strategic plan. There was no directive from Eisenhower or Marshall ordering the teaching of baseball as a tool of denazification. The soldiers did it because it was what they did. Baseball was as natural to them as breathing. It was what they played in training camps, on troop ships, in the brief lulls between battles. It was the sound of summer, the rhythm of home. And now, in the ruins of the Third Reich, it became a language they could share with children who spoke no English and had been taught to hate them. The children came slowly at first. They watched from behind walls, from the edges of the field. Some were sent by their mothers, who hoped the Americans might give them food. Others came out of sheer boredom, or desperation for anything that was not hunger or rubble. A few came because they were still young enough to remember what play felt like, before the war consumed everything. The soldiers did not ask questions. They did not interrogate the children about their fathers or their beliefs. They simply handed them gloves, showed them where to stand, and began to pitch. The game itself was baffling. Why did one boy stand with a stick and try to hit the ball? Why did the others scatter across the field? Why did they run in a circle when the ball was hit? What was the purpose? But the longer they played, the less the purpose mattered. The game had a rhythm, a structure, a set of rules that everyone could follow. It had moments of tension and release, moments where a boy could be a hero or a fool, but either way, everyone would clap and laugh and start again, proving oneself in blood. It was about taking turns, about fairness, about the idea that even if you struck out, you would get another chance. The Hitler Youth had been built on the concept of the Volk, the people as a unified, organic whole. The individual was nothing, the collective was everything. Boys were taught to surrender their will, to dissolve into the mass, to find meaning only in the tribe. They marched in formation, sang in unison, and were told that their value lay in their obedience to the leader and the state. There was no room for improvisation, for personal expression, for the kind of chaotic joy that came from a sandlot baseball game where no two plays were ever the same. Baseball, by contrast, was a game of individuals within a team. A boy stood alone at the plate, bat in hand, and faced the pitcher in a duel of skill and nerve. He succeeded or failed on his own merit. But his success meant something only because of the team, because of the runners on base, the fielders behind him, the shared goal of victory. It was a microcosm of the democratic ideal, individual freedom within a structure of mutual responsibility. The children did not articulate this, of course. They could not have. They were hungry and traumatized, and trying to survive in a world that had been turned inside out. But they felt it. They felt it in the way the Americans did not demand perfection, did not punish mistakes, did not shout at them the way their Jungvolk leaders had shouted. They felt it in the way a soldier would put his arm around a boy who missed an easy catch and say something encouraging, even if the boy did not understand the words. One girl in Cologne, 12 years old, later recalled in an oral history recorded in the 1980s that she had been terrified of the Americans. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front, and her mother had told her that the Allies would take revenge, that they would do to German children what German soldiers had done in Poland and Russia. But then she saw them playing baseball in the square, and one of the soldiers waved her over. He gave her a glove, showed her how to catch, and when she dropped the ball 3 times in a row, he just laughed and picked it up again. She said she cried that night, not from sadness, but from confusion. She did not understand why the enemy was being kind. The American abundance was everywhere, and it was the second shock. The children had grown up in a world of ration cards and ersatz coffee, of bread mixed with sawdust and coats made from old curtains. They had been told that this was noble, that sacrifice was the German way, that the Allies were starving and desperate while the Reich stood strong. But the Americans did not look starved. They did not look desperate. They had chocolate. Not the thin, bitter wartime chocolate the children remembered from before the shortages, but thick bars wrapped in brown paper, sweet and rich. They had gum, a substance most German children had never seen, which you could chew for hours without swallowing. They had white bread, canned meat, cigarettes in packs of 20, socks without holes, boots that were not held together with wire. They had baseballs and gloves and bats, objects made purely for play, in a world where everything was supposed to be repurposed for survival. The children could not reconcile this. They had been told that America was weak, that it was a nation of shopkeepers and gangsters, that its economy was collapsing and its people were divided. But here were these soldiers, who gave away food as if it were nothing, who threw away cigarette butts that German adults scrambled to collect and re-roll. The American jeeps were new and fast. The American uniforms were clean. The American soldiers had teeth that were white and straight, not rotted and broken like the teeth of so many Germans who had lived through years of malnutrition. In Heidelberg, a group of boys approached a baseball game and stood watching. One of the soldiers noticed them and walked over. He pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket and broke it into pieces, handing one to each boy. The boys stared at the chocolate as if it were gold. One of them, a thin 14-year-old named Klaus, later wrote in his diary that he ate the chocolate slowly, letting it melt on his tongue, and thought about how he had been lied to. If the Americans had this much to give away, he wrote, what else had been a lie? The game itself became a symbol, though not immediately. In the first weeks and months of occupation, it was simply a diversion, a way for soldiers to pass the time and for children to forget their hunger. But as the summer of 1945 turned into autumn, and as the occupation settled into a routine, in the Soviet zone, children did not play baseball. They attended political lectures, sang songs about Stalin, and were organized into youth groups that resembled the Hitler Youth in all but name. The emphasis was on discipline, on collective identity, on preparation for the struggle ahead. The message was clear. The war was not over. It had simply changed form. In the American zone, children played baseball. The contrast was not lost on the adults. German parents, many of whom were quietly trying to distance themselves from the Nazi past, saw in the baseball games a vision of a different kind of society. Here were soldiers who did not bark orders, who did not demand ideological purity, who treated children as children rather than as political instruments. Here was a culture that believed in leisure, in play, in the idea that life could be something other than a perpetual march toward destiny. The communist press in East Germany denounced the baseball games as decadent, as a distraction from the serious work of rebuilding. They called it a symbol of American superficiality, proof that the West cared more about entertainment than justice. But the children in the West kept playing. They learned the rules, invented their own variations, and began to form teams. By 1946, there were informal baseball leagues in several American-occupied cities, organized by soldiers and played by German boys who had once worn swastikas and marched in torchlight parades. Private Eddie Kowalski, the soldier in Berlin, never knew what happened to Helmut, the boy he taught to throw. He was rotated home in the fall of 1945, returned to Chicago, and worked in a factory for the rest of his life. He did not think of himself as having done anything important. He had simply played catch with a kid, but Helmut remembered. In 1952, he emigrated to the United States, settling in Milwaukee. He worked as a mechanic, raised 3 children, and never returned to Germany. In 1987, he was interviewed by a graduate student researching the American occupation. He spoke about the baseball game, about the soldier with the easy smile, about the moment when he realized that the enemy was not what he had been taught. "I had been told that Americans were weak," he said, "because they valued comfort over struggle. But I came to understand that comfort is not weakness. It is a choice. A society that can afford to play, that can afford to be kind, that can afford to give chocolate to the children of its enemies, that is not a weak society. That is a society that has one." The symbolism of the baseball, that small leather sphere, became embedded in the mythology of the occupation. It represented more than a game. It represented a worldview. In the totalitarian imagination, resources are hoarded, pleasure is deferred, and every object must serve the state. But here was an object that served no purpose except joy. The baseball was not practical. It did not feed anyone, did not house anyone, did not rebuild the factories or clear the rubble. It existed purely for the sake of play, for the idea that life could contain moments of lightness even in the midst of ruin. The children who played baseball in the summer of 1945 were the first generation of Germans to grow up without Hitler. They were the bridge between the old world and the new, between the ideology of sacrifice and the promise of abundance. Many of them would later speak of that summer as the moment when the war truly ended, not with surrender or treaties, but with the simple act of catching a ball. By 1948, Germany was divided. The lines that would define the Cold War were being drawn, and the baseball games had mostly faded into memory. The soldiers had gone home, the rubble was being cleared, and the children were becoming teenagers, navigating a world that was rebuilding itself in 2 incompatible images. But the lesson remained. The boys who had played baseball in the American zone grew up in a society that, however imperfectly, embraced the ideals of democracy, of individual freedom, of the belief that abundance was not a sin but a possibility. They grew up in a society that built parks and schools. The boys in the East grew up differently. They were taught that history was a march, that sacrifice was eternal, that the struggle was never over. They were taught to be suspicious of pleasure, of leisure, of anything that distracted from the collective mission. They did not play baseball, they drilled. There is a photograph, taken in Munich in August of 1945, that captures something of this moment. It shows a group of German boys standing in a ragged line, gloves on their hands, watching as an American soldier demonstrates a pitch. The boys are thin, their clothes patched and too large, but their faces are focused, almost hopeful. In the background, the city is rubble, but in the foreground there is a game. The photograph was never famous. It was not published in Life magazine or used in propaganda. It simply exists in an archive, a record of a moment when the future was uncertain and the past was unbearable, and a group of children learned that play was possible again. The legacy of those baseball games is difficult to measure. There is no straight line from a game of catch in Berlin to the Marshall Plan, or to the democratic constitution of West Germany, or to the eventual reunification of the country. History does not work that way, but symbols matter. Symbols shape how people imagine themselves, how they understand what is possible. The baseball was a symbol of a different kind of power. Not the power of tanks and bombs, though America had those in abundance, but the power of culture, of values, of a vision of life that did not require enemies and sacrifices and endless struggle. It was the power of a society that believed, however imperfectly, that people could govern themselves, that individuals had worth, that the future did not have to be a march toward destiny but could be a game, with rules and fairness and the possibility of joy. Helmut, the boy who learned to throw in the rubble of Berlin, lived until 2003. He was buried in Wisconsin, in a cemetery that overlooks a small lake. His gravestone is simple, with his name and dates. But his children remember the stories he told, about the soldier with the smile, about the leather ball that seemed so strange, about the day he realized that the war was over not because the guns had stopped, but because someone had handed him a chance to play. That is the truth those baseball games taught. That abundance is not decadence. That kindness is not weakness. That a society which has room for play, for generosity, for the belief that even the children of enemies deserve a chance to be children, that society has won something more important than a war. It has won the future. And the sound of a leather ball slapping into a glove, echoing across the ruins of a fallen empire, was the sound of that future arriving.